and welcome to the Open Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Shubnur Shah, and today, as always, we have a very special guest. In fact, our guest today is an Australian open source community contributor, commentator, and advocate. She is someone who, in 2012, was awarded the Rusty Wrench Award from Linux Australia in recognition of her contributions. She has served in the board positions with community organizations including Open Source Industry Australia, Drupal Association, and the ADA Initiative, and was a lead organizer of the 2008 Linux conference in Melbourne. Donna is also the product owner for the Open Practice Library, the same one that we keep referring to always in our podcast. So it is my absolute pleasure to welcome to the podcast our special guest, my kindred spirit and my intellectual ally, who I have the pleasure of calling a friend, the one and only Donna Benjamin. Welcome, Donna.
Oh, oh, thank you, Shabnor. That's such a lovely intro. Yeah, look, it's an absolute pleasure to join you on your podcast, and we get to talk about one of our favorite topics of open leadership. So I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. It's such a delight to have you here. So Donna, you and I have had a chance to collaborate and work closely, at Red Hat Open Innovation Labs. In fact, if you remember, you and I started our journey at Red Hat Open Innovation Labs in 2019. And you remember us going through the DevOps culture and practice experience with the
It was
amazing Tim
amazing.
Beattie, some of our
Tim
other.
Beattie.
So Donna, because I'm not at Red Hat anymore, could you share with us with the listeners about your current role at Red Hat?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a senior engagement lead in Red Hat's Open Innovation Labs. And the Open Innovation Labs was set up to really help our customers reap real value out of our technology platforms. And to do that, they needed to align their people and their process to make the most of those platforms. And so the Open Innovation Labs was born as an in-depth and intensive time-boxed engagement. We call it the residency. We're still running residencies. In 2020, this thing came along called COVID-19, and we all went into lockdown. And the residency had originally been a very intensely co-located. Like we'd go to a hotel, even we'd have breakfast together, we'd have dinner, together at the end of the day, lunch. It was very a kind of hothouse. But once we suddenly had to work virtually, we mentioned Tim Beattie before. He got a bunch of us together to kind of reimagine the residency as a virtual residency. And 5 years later, it's kind of become sort of a normal way of working for many people, whereas back then it was quite sort of unusual or even radical for some who thought it just couldn't be done. I think the really, for me, the most important aspect of it is this focus on an outcome rather than necessarily just normal consulting where you might go to install a piece of software or configure it. In the Open Innovation Labs, we wanted to really tune in to what the business or the customer really needed. What was the outcome they were looking for? And I think that was a different frame of reference.
Brilliant. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, so many things came up. Of course, pandemic really changed the way we started functioning and operating. I mean, I think it was a big push for everyone, right, to adopt new ways of working or different ways of working. And I
Very
like the
much
word.
so.
I love the word that you said, reimagine. The ways of working, because we had to get so creative and work in distributed teams. Our amazing colleague who's no more with us, Ilaria, she was a product owner to define how distributed teams would work. And it really was uncomfortable phase, but it also brought to us how we could work differently and think differently.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm glad you bring up Ilaria, because it's always lovely to remember her and hold her in our thoughts.
Yeah.
She really did lead that work for us to think about how we could work together. And I think we're all richer for her investment in that initiative. Yeah.
Indeed. And I also like what you said about focusing on the outcomes. And that was something that I learned at Red Hat Open Innovation teams, working with you all, right? The difference between output and outcomes, and that was such a game changer in so many ways, especially when we had to work with clients or even work with each other, right? It was about, okay, what are we trying to do, right? What is the outcome? And it just helped you get you step back from getting into the activity mode. Like, before we dive in, Donna, I want to take a brief moment to read out and remind our listeners about the open leadership definition. Everyone, just for you to know what we're talking about, what open leadership is, I just want to kind of refer back to the definition that's been created by the community. So I'll just read it out. So, open leadership is a mindset and set of behaviors that anyone can learn and practice. Open leaders think and act in service to another person, group, team, or enterprise, attempting to accomplish something together. This means that they are not necessarily the people high up on the hierarchy or key decision makers. I think that's very important to me, and we'll talk about that as well. That is, open leaders are people with character who give agency to those around them. In this way, their role as leaders is not permanent or predestined. It is evolving and fluid given the task at hand. Open leaders are especially adept at building organizations that embody the character of an open organization. And these include key 5 characteristics like transparency, inclusivity, adaptability, collaboration, and community. And because these principles are interconnected, open leaders espouse all of them.
I love that last bit. Because
Yeah.
these are interconnected, open leaders espouse all of them. It's a really lovely way to finish that statement. And the thing that
Yeah.
stood out for me that time, people who give agency to those around them. And I think that's a real key to open leadership, which is perhaps not in some of the other leaderships. It's about they giving agency to others. Maybe people don't think of that if they're thinking about the traditional
Yes.
command and control type leader. Yeah, and lovely. Thank you for reading that out.
Thanks for calling it out. I love that too. I'm thinking about, yeah, that's so true. Like, we do talk about leadership, and the first image, even in my mind, often is about a leader on a bit of a pedestal, or someone on the in the hierarchy, leading or taking charge of everything, right? Like, that's the image that still comes to my mind because we're so used to thinking of a leader in that sense. But here it's really about leader as being part of that group or the community. I think that's the reason why community is so important, that you're not the central person, or not the central authority, but you're the sort of a facilitator. And there could be, so when you're adopting the open leadership mindset, that means there could be multiple people or roles acting as open leaders, right? And that is something hard to grapple with, right? Because we always think about power and authority when it comes to leadership roles.
It's a really interesting, I think there's a dynamic there in the way we think about leadership. I'm reminded of a leadership workshop that I did some years back with a guy called Adam Goodwin. I think that's his name. Anyway, he introduced this idea about leaders have followers, but there is no leader without the follower. And there is not the same body of knowledge around followership. And there isn't even a good word for, in English at least, for followership. And it made me think about, well, there's a word which is fellowship, which linguistically seems kind of similar, but it's really stuck with me, that thing. If we have the leader and follower, but this idea about that dynamic between them, and that you're not a leader until someone's saying, hey, yeah, I'm going to follow. And the thing that makes a leader is their first followers. And that's always I've always found that really interesting since that time, to sort of reflect on that. Like, you can just have a crazy person with a vision, but if no one follows them.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I'm also pondering over it. I'll not take too much time pondering over that continuously here. But the whole concept of followership, like, we have the leadership really defined, but we don't talk so much about the followership and what it entails, right? We always think of leaders and subordinates, or leaders and we don't even think followers, do we? We think leaders and employees, for example.
Yeah.
Or it almost like as if it's like a secondary secondary role, right? And maybe it
Yeah.
comes from the fact that in organizations, because supposed leaders or managers have the authority over people, it sort of gives them a privileged position, which is true. I mean, I don't want to deny the fact that in organizations there are certain privileges that comes with being in, in the hierarchy, right? And that's why, like, the whole
And being
focus can
in
shift to
charge.
being in charge, but
Yeah.
taking decisions, right? Like signing the
Yeah.
orders. I mean, that also
Yeah.
can be addictive, isn't it? Like,
Yeah.
maybe that's one of the reasons why open leadership can also be, like, for a lot of people who seek a lot of relevance and validation or self confirmation through their job. For them, open leadership can be a little hard to grapple with, because suddenly it's not about focus in you. It's like focusing on the outcomes, you're focusing on what is being decided by the team. I just feel that you're not at the center. And that, for many of us, letting go of that can be hard. What do you think?
I think for some, absolutely. But I'm also kind of curious around this idea of followership as when you choose to follow, that's an active thing to be doing, and there's an agency in that. So coming
Hmm.
back to that
Hmm.
point about open leaders give agency to other people.
Hmm.
And in the world of open source, where, a lot of this sort of inspiration comes from, we don't have control over people who choose to contribute to our
Hmm.
projects.
Hmm.
So that they are choosing to contribute their time and energy. And I wonder if that's a thread that's kind of been
Hmm.
woven into our concept of open leadership because of
Hmm.
that heritage, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. And that's a valid point, because open source, open organize, I mean, that's where everything around open organization and open leadership really comes from, right? And it's when I'm thinking of it now, there is a context and there is a way of operating in that environment and in that context, right? So people coming from open source, for them, it's probably easier to adapt that kind of thinking and operating. And when you go to, like, hardcore corporations or organizations which has a, a different style of leading and managing, it can be hard. One of my desire, Donna, is to help those organizations and leaders see that open leadership doesn't take power away from you. In fact, it gives you the authority, it gives you the power that you might seek consciously or unconsciously, even if it's for getting the results that you're wanting, because it gives you the tools, it gives you the resources, and it gives you the ways and methods to leverage everything around you. And it connects back to what you said about followership. And if people are onboarded to a vision, and they have a place in the organization to come along, follow along with you, and you have the right mindset, which we think open leadership can bring into your existing style of working and leading, that can be really powerful. Open leadership is also, or leadership is also about influence, right? Influence is what really creates that followership. You can have fearful followers, but the true
Yeah.
followership through agencies is actually about that, right? That people willing to follow you, not forced to follow you.
Yes, and that is key, right? What you just said, people who are willing to follow you,
Mm.
not forced to follow you.
Hmm.
And even a step beyond willing, like people who are choosing to follow you,
Yeah,
not
yeah,
forced to
choosing to
follow
follow
you,
you. Indeed,
right?
indeed.
I think it's an interesting puzzle to kind of think through.
Yes. Donna, now that we have a little context set about open leadership, so you have been associated with the world of open source for many years. So, in essence, you've probably already been practicing open ways of working and leading. Could you share about your journey, especially after we as community define open leadership principles and the term open leadership was coined? What has that been like?
So I guess a little bit about my background in that I for many years ran my own small business called Creative Contingencies. I mean, it still exists, but it's sort of very much on the back burner. But in doing so, it was a very small business, just me and my husband. And we kind of did what we could do. But the world of the web was, growing massively. And so we had a web side to our business and we had an event side to our business. And we developed our own content management system. Pete wrote it himself. And at some point in time, it just got impossible to manage. So we went looking for an open source content management system. At that time, there were many to choose from. We went, well, we choose the language that we're familiar with, and it has to be open source. And so we picked Drupal and got involved in the Drupal community. And I eventually was elected to the board of the Drupal Association. And that was very interesting, because I'm not a developer myself, but I was an organizer. I'd organized meetups and events and wrangled various things. So it was a way that I was able to contribute to the Drupal community through service. So I guess in some ways that's the foundation for open leadership, even though I perhaps wouldn't have called it that. I remember having a very strange moment where people were kind of pointing the fingers at us. There was some drama going on in the community, and they said, "You're all leaders and you're all responsible for this." And I went, I hadn't thought about what I was doing at that point as explicitly leadership. But after that, it was a real kind of a point where I appreciated it differently. And I did get his name wrong before. Adam Goodman, not Goodwin. Adam Goodman was a facilitator that we had for some of our board meetings, and then he went on to become the chair of the board for some time. And he's a leadership academic in, I think, Northwestern Uni in the US. And I learned a lot from him. And I think while he wasn't talking about open leadership then, I think he very much espoused, the same kinds of concepts.
Yeah.
And I think specifically to open leadership, I think we owe a lot to Jim Whitehurst's stewardship of Red Hat as CEO, and then the book, The Open Organization, and out of that came open leadership.
Yeah.
And Jim didn't come to Red Hat with that. Jim learnt about it at Red Hat, and he had a bunch of aha moments in his early days where he'd issued some edicts and nothing happened, and he kind of said, "Well, why haven't you all done it?" I said, "Well, we all had a chat afterwards, and we thought it wasn't going to be useful, so we just didn't do it." And it was just like,
yeah, that's such a funny story,
right?
Isn't it?
It's such a great story, and I sort of think about that, and then one of the videos that we use in our DevOps culture and practice enablement is about David Marquet, the submarine captain.
Yes.
And I think there are sort of some echoes about what David Marquet says that I think Jim Whitehurst also spoke about. So I think that this concept of open leadership is one that has many inputs and has kind of developed in this really nice organic way, and people who have been very much involved in open source and open communities of various kinds have had an impact on what we think of as open leadership.
Indeed. I'm glad you mentioned that, because the bringing open leadership, the term and everything around it has been a huge community effort, right? Both internally at Red Hat, but also the open organization community. And my intent is to get everyone, one by one on the podcast to talk about this, because this work it's not one person's job. Of course, Jim Whitehurst set the context for it. Like he says, set the context and get out of the way. That's exactly what's happened, right? And the community has worked exhaustively in defining open leadership. And of course, started off with open organization, and then an open organization really focuses on creating holistic and open organizational cultures which support such transformations to take place related to technology. But then we feel that with open organization, it's also about transforming organizations culturally, right, from a leadership perspective, right? So it just kind of keeps getting extended, and open leadership is all about that. So thank you for bringing that up. Really love it. We accelerated the work at Red Hat Open Innovation Labs, and I always love to take a moment to also thank the leadership at that time, with Mike Walker, Nick, and Jeremy, all these people who were really pioneers and trailblazers in that sense, to create the space for work like we did around open leadership specifically, really. And I just sort of take it upon myself to continue that journey so that's not forgotten, but really bring back open leadership back to light. So you have been part of that journey, Donna, so thank you.
Well, thank you. It's been an absolute privilege to work with you and learn from you, Shibnor, because I think there was there was an intellectual rigor that you brought to the question that I certainly admired and learnt from. And there was just this rich, I remember we had this kind of crazy Miro board, right? And there was just this like rich kind of pickings of resources and references and a depth to it. Whereas, ultimately it became very simple, and
Yeah.
you've got your 5 principles, right? It's very simple to be able to communicate that. But there's this real, earthy foundation beneath it, which I think
Yeah.
we owe to you.
Thank you. Right. It's being no with the help of the right people around. I think it just gets easier. The smart, intelligent people that I've had the privilege of like working with, people like yourself, and it's just incredible how much you learn in the process, and it's a fantastic experience. Anyways, I'll probably create a separate podcast just praising everybody. At some point, but like that, now that I have you here, maybe I should just focus on some of these questions that I have for you. So Donna, it is quite evident to me, at least, that I always emphasize to anyone who cares to hear or is interested, that open leadership is a leadership philosophy and a model that is powered by agile, lean design thinking and more. Do you firstly see it the same way?
Good question. I don't know that I've thought about that in those terms before, but there are so many different inputs, I guess, to open leadership. And to me, they all kind of end up being munged together in my head. And I was actually saying just recently, like, I have no faith that I have an original idea in my head. Everything I think or do or say has been informed by what I've seen or read or heard or discussed with other people, right? And so Agile, I did, Scrum training, more than a decade ago. I've done Kanban training. I've done design thinking. I need to do more systems thinking, and we've got to go and check out Diana Montalyon's work. She's about to publish a book on systems thinking. Awesome. But, I think open leadership is a product of its time. And I often talk about open source and agile being the twin revolutions of information technology, right? They've been happening in parallel and generally have not had a huge amount of overlap. But that's why I was so excited to discover the Open Practice Library and Open Innovation Labs, because it brought these things together for me for the first time. Other people have since said, oh, no, there's lots of other intersections. But that was the aha for me. These things have so much in common and yet had been like running on parallel tracks rather than, a mishmash. But open leadership definitely, like, whilst it obviously draws the principles of open from open source and free software, things like open education resources and open data and open science, these have all learned from open source. Open leadership, though, has also very much drawn, as you sort of suggest, from concepts like lean and agile and, the power being within the team and this leadership being a team sport rather than an individual hero. So I think there's more to explore there, but I would say to your premise, yes. Once I've thought about it, yes.
No, this is interesting. Actually, this dawned on me also, like when I had started work on how do we bring open leadership to our customers, like philosophically had we understood to some extent, to some degree, like yes, it's based on the open source development model, and we're looking at open organization from an organizational perspective. Can we replicate the success of open source as it did in technology in organizational thinking, and like the system thinking that you mentioned about, but organizationally what can it do and create that magic? And that's the time, in fact, because we were using so many practices from agile, and we were referencing back to the agile values and things like that. And agile at that time I was aware of it, but I hadn't gotten my hands into agile like I did at labs, and then I've said, oh, okay, so a lot of work that we're doing is actually around agile. So this is the kind of a vehicle we're using to bring those the outcomes that we are wanting to achieve. And I think that's when I started seeing the linkage. In fact, I remember a conversation with Mike, and said, like, Mike, we're talking about open leadership, so I just see that we need to have agile practices particularly, but of course we discovered there are all these other models that are also in there, because open leadership is not like one uh, fixed model, right? It's so, when you start looking at it closely, Don, I'm sure you'd agree with me that you just find, oh, it has an element of servant leadership in it. It has elements of transformation leadership in it, and in a way, at one moment I thought, oh, it's like, so it's everything. So how will we kind of tell people what it is? But then it also kind of was relieving, because it gives us access to almost everything that's already there. So we're not creating or tapping into something new or different, except for a few things around the mindset, that it's not about hierarchies, and it's like in the community based leadership.
Yeah, look, I think this idea of it being maybe more of a quilt or a mosaic of,
Yeah.
there are lots of different elements that have been brought in to kind of create this like rich picture, or, is it a tapestry or a mosaic or something? But it's lots of pieces. And in some cases, maybe that seems like an ugly mishmash, but the reality is there's a flexibility to it. So people can bring their own experience and style and then draw on these different influences and aspects as they develop their own sense of self. Because, a common starting point for a lot of leadership training or
Hmm.
enablement is you've got to start with understanding more about your own self, your own way of showing up for other people and why you do what you do, right? So there is a bit of self-centeredness there, right, in a way, before you can be a true, whether it's servant leadership or
Yeah.
even if you're going to be, authoritative control, there's certainly an element of, knowing who you are and why you're there.
Hmm.
You're
Hmm.
going to be able to effectively communicate that and have people choose to follow.
No, so beautifully said. I can just listen to you, Donna. Just keep speaking, and I'm hypnotized. Thank
Just
you
my
for that.
weird accent, right? It's just my weird
Nah,
accent.
oh, well, that too. That helps.
Well, I just think there's something really kind of interesting to puzzle on in this.
Mm,
Where did it come like where did open leadership come from? Did it spring fully formed, like a kind of, a dream? But no, I think it's very much a product of a whole lot of things that have come
yes,
before it, a lot of
indeed.
thinking, and but also importantly a lot of practice. And I guess that comes
Mm,
back a little bit to the open practice library, is there's a
yes,
doing part of it, right?
yes,
It's not just philosophical. There's
yes.
also behaviors that um, we want to reward, and some that we say, hey, that's
Mm,
not what we consider to be open
yeah.
leadership.
I would love to continue having these conversations, to kind of keep chewing on it, because there's so much more there, right? We're not done. We're like probably just at the starting point, really. Anything to do with open organization and open leadership. It's still so nascent, You remember that trend? What was that we were doing on Google the other day?
Yeah, we're playing with Google Trends. That's
Yes.
right.
So
Yes.
Donna and I, like, for our listeners, we were spending some time and doing some geeky stuff that Donna gets me to do. And we went to the Google Trends, right? Would you like to share about that
Should we
experience,
do,
Donna?
should I,
Yeah.
should we have a play? Should I bring it up
Yeah.
and
Actually,
share?
the idea of saying that, when we say that open leadership and open organization are still at a nascent stage, this is what we mean by it. That, when you look it up, people, organizations worldwide still don't know as much about open organization principles, and what open leadership is, and how can be how it can be part of the way of leading and working. So let's see what came up. And
Here we go. I think this is the right window
yeah, it's
coming
visible.
up.
Thank you. Oh, that's lovely. Yeah.
Okay, great. So, what do we want to explore? So we want to try open leadership, right? Open
Mhm.
leadership. Explore.
So when we say explored, we're looking at how many times the term open leadership has been
Yeah,
searched.
so this
Hmm.
is the past day, so not so much. So let's try the past 12 months.
Yeah, let's see. Must be all the
Let
work
me
that we
make
have
this a
done.
little bigger. There we go.
All
Interest
right.
over time over 12
Mm,
months. So we had a bit of a dip around, well, Christmas, the
yeah.
end of the year, the
Right.
low of 31 and the high up here around 98. Now, I want to note that the scale here, 25 to
Mm,
100, is like 100 is just max
mm,
and 0 is minimum.
mm-hmm.
So, or So it's not the total number of
Okay.
searches or whatever. It's kind of showing you a range of the peaks. So that's open leadership. And then I think it's sort of interesting to compare, let's say, open leadership and open organization. And I suppose I should use the American spelling.
I keep making that. I don't know if it's even a mistake, but I just sometimes I have to remind myself to switch between the Z and the S, depending who I'm writing to.
Yes. Yeah. And in Australia, both are valid, which doesn't help, right? So you can go either choose American spelling or British spelling. Both are valid in Australia. So, here's interesting. So a lot more for open organization than for open leadership. And this is kind of fun. What was some of the others we were playing with?
We were comparing open leadership with transformation leadership, right? Like, because in digitally transforming organizations, we've heard a lot about transformation leadership style. And we're looking at, how does that show up?
Open leadership is bigger than transformative leadership. Let me try transformation leadership.
Transformation leadership. Yeah, it's transformation leadership. Okay.
Open leadership still wins.
That's it's all the work that we've been doing.
So let's try servant leadership. We talked about servant leadership as well, right? That'll be much bigger for servant leadership, much more common.
Yes, I've heard a lot of people talk a lot more about servant leadership, and I often see a lot of overlap as well in open leadership, and sort of a lot of similarities, I would say, between the two.
I think there's probably maybe we need to do like a massive Venn diagram of different kinds of leaderships. Like, what are the characteristics? What's common? What are the outliers? That would be fun. Let's add another one. So open leadership, servant leadership.
How about democratic leadership or coaching?
Okay. Let's try them both. Democratic leadership, autocratic leadership.
What I'm thinking of, Donna, is in corporations or in institutions, we don't talk about, or we don't hear that, okay, we are going to practice autocratic leadership, right?
No one says that, right?
Or I'm
going to be an autocrat.
Laissez-faire, or I'm going to be we are going to be a charismatic leadership organization. Maybe that still has a bit of a positive twist, Like, servant leadership is a very, very well defined, and that's the reason it stands out as well, you see?
Democratic leadership and servant leadership leading the pack by a considerable amount. Whereas charismatic and open really at the bottom there.
There could be one reason for it, Donna, and I'm just speculating here, is that servant leadership is academically recognized as a model, and transformation leadership as well has a lot of academic backing to it.
Their transformational leadership even outpaces servant leadership.
Yes. Yeah, so this is what we do when Donna and I meet. I do have a question that I always ask, but I think I have two questions. Maybe I'll just throw them in and see if we can do a shorter version today, and then we can do a longer version some other time. So coming back to open leadership, Australia is a huge continent, and would it be fair to say that it is also culturally different from the rest of the world? And I'm really curious to know, like, looking at it from a cultural point of view, right? What possibilities and limitations do you see practicing open leadership in an Australian setting?
A great question. So Australia is, I feel like I should say, is either the world's largest island or the world's smallest continent, and you can debate, where it lies, but it's the unceded lands of over 250 nations, First Nations peoples, and I think that brings its own special something to the landmass that is Australia, the great southern land at the bottom of the sea. For many, many years, it didn't appear on maps, right? Because the cartography of Europe was unknown what was down at the bottom of the world until various ships came down. But for the people who lived here, they always knew it was here, right? So in terms of is it culturally different? I think it's hard for me to really answer. It's like asking a fish, is the water you live in different, right? Yeah. But I have had the opportunity to travel and be in different places, and I think there is probably something a bit different about Australia. I think we've got a lot in common with the rest of the English speaking world. We're probably the New Zealanders are probably our closest kindred spirits, but we're also almost like siblings, right? So we have our moments, but we're very much part of the Anglo sphere, if you like.
Mm,
But that said, we've got this First Nations kind of heritage underpinning beneath that. And then we've also got one of the world's most multicultural communities, where we've literally got people who've come from all over the world to call Australia home. And for various reasons, whether it's been, fleeing conflict, or, in search of just, people who love to travel, who come and then never leave. There's great migration stories of all kinds. And I think that also brings with it a certain openness, because people bring different perspectives from wherever they've come, and you either choose to embrace that difference or you turn it away. And the fact that we've continued to have people come, I think, adds to that sense of openness. Where does open leadership fit? I think it's unevenly distributed. There's a beautiful quote from I think William Gibson, as a sci-fi writer, says, "The future is here, it's just not evenly distributed." And I think open leadership might be a bit like that too. Some of us have lived it and breathed it and have internalized it. And for others, it's still perhaps a bit strange and scary. And so I think in Australia that there would be some who would live and breathe it without perhaps knowing the term. And there are others for whom it would be, what's this?
Yeah. And it sounds pretty similar to what I've heard other guests say from different parts of the world as well. Just like with everything, there's a spectrum, right? And I think with open leadership also is a spectrum in itself, right? It's not that you are an open leader, you were a closed leader, if I could use an opposite, like there's nothing like that. But like there's just not a sudden shift. There are days when I'm being a very good open leader, and there are days when I'm being a miserable one, not being a leader at all. So it's like it's like a dashboard, or it's like that. If I can think of a visual, it's like sometimes I'm on this side of the scale, sometime on the other side, and it just keeps shifting. Do you see it the same way as well?
Look, I think it's a good question. I think everything is more fluid than some people would like it to be. Like I'm quite cheeky. Quite often people will present a binary choice. It's this or that. I go, and right? It's not this or that. There's always something else, a third, a different perspective. And even if the option is this or that, then it's like, well, what about the perspective of the person choosing, right? That's a different, So I always think that I'm not a great decision maker, right? I prefer to wait for more information, and I can be quite uncomfortable being forced to make a decision quickly. And for me, it's because there's always something just outside of you that you haven't considered that you might want to take into account. And leadership is probably a bit like that. Is it's slightly different for everybody, and there's going to be a spectrum of where it's appropriate and where perhaps like an example where perhaps you want to have more command and control type scenario is in a disaster, where you want everyone to really quickly get into a, follow the drill. We know what we're doing. We don't need to kind of discuss and get consensus about what needs to happen here. We need to put this fire out. And so everyone get your hoses and go, right? So I think that open leadership has that flexibility in it, right? Where you say, we need to find the right approach for the moment. And that's got to be adaptive and flexible.
Yeah, so nicely said. So one more question, Donna, before we start like wrapping up for today. And it's a question I've always asked all my guests, right? And it's about like in a world that seems to be gravitating towards command and control, right? Thought policing, information control and doxing and censorship and just, degrees of dissent suppression, host of other things, right? And that's how I'm seeing the world operating in that. I don't know if you see it the same way, but do you think that in whatever times we're living in, that open leadership and open organizations even stand a chance?
Look, I don't know, but I hope that it will continue to grow. And I think that the more we share it with open hearts and open minds, the more likely that is to be. However, in some ways, the forces of darkness are always kind of there as well, right? And like I said before, sometimes there's a time and a place for a more autocratic kind of mode, but I think it should be in the minority rather than the majority. And I like to think that, again, coming back to something we said right at the start about open leaders giving people agency, I think individual agency for collective intent and collective benefit is a winning formula.
So well said. Like you tied it so beautifully from the beginning to the end with agency, Donna. Thank you for that. So Donna, I really want to thank you today. Thanks for being here. Thanks for sharing. Thank you for showing us the geeky trends. What is the best way for people to connect with you?
Probably these days LinkedIn. Once upon a time I would have said Twitter, but I don't use that anymore. But yeah, I think LinkedIn, Donna Benjamin, Australia, LinkedIn, you should probably find me there. We can probably again share the link in the show notes.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you, dear listeners. Please do share your comments and thoughts about, what appeals to you the most about open leadership and what do you find challenging about it. So till then, stay well and see you in the next podcast. Thank you again, Donna.